David. David, we talk about the Pact for Skills. I mean, this is also what ECIS is showing us. It's about, you know, reskilling and upskilling communities. So it's the crisis mode in that sense made new ways of thinking, new ways of working, new ways necessary to learn new skills. I mean, the fermentation, so to say, is one skill I guess we have to learn. But you will talk also a little bit more about the broader sense. So David is somehow the leader of the consortium for the Blueprint. Blueprint is an initiative from the European Commission to monitor, to measure the and upskilling initiatives in Europe. But you will talk a little bit more. You are also professor in the HKU in Utrecht.
Yes, thank you, Garen, very much for the introduction. I will be brief. I'm aware that there's not much time left. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah, I think so. Okay, the name of this new initiative is cyanotypes. If you recognize that word, could you put your hand up? That's what I thought. Only the people already in this initiative actually know what that means. It's just the process that makes a blueprint. So when we were preparing this application, we went back to the artistic roots of the notion of a blueprint. What I'd like to do very briefly, first of all, I have many, many slides which I won't use, but I would like to distribute this presentation afterwards. So if you are interested, please go back to the original presentation. And basically, this is a ground-up project. And this is something, so if anything, this is a call to action. We've heard some wonderful presentations about the circumstances in which we live. And I think that that fierce urgency is well understood. This project is to anticipate future skills for the cultural and creative sector. So, very briefly, the Commission has a format called Alliances for Innovation, and under that, the aim is to boost the innovation capacity. Now, this is probably in a more traditional sense, more traditional understanding of what innovation is, but there's no strict understanding of what that is. We also understand that we need new narratives for non-technological innovation, just as much as we need to revisit existing narratives for incremental innovation. But the idea is to boost the provision of new skills, to identify the gaps, the specific gaps where we can upskill and reskill, but also to anticipate future skills for the sector as a whole. There is a particular focus on post-COVID, I don't know what post-COVID is, digital skills and green skills. And of course the overlap between the two is essentially that they are transformative skills. So the two strands of this program, one is the Pact for Skills, and the Pact for Skills is essentially building a community and a constituency of people who are interested, different types of stakeholders who are interested in the skills ecosystem, shall we say. This partnership was formally launched earlier this year in April and run by, among others, ECBN, but also the BEDA, the Design Associations, and the Creative Skills Europe platform. I think now there are something like, may I have a look, something like 100, more than 100 different organizations who have signed up. And I would urge you to sign your organizations up also to this platform, to this constituency, this community. It is a collaborative process, and there is a manifesto. So if you go, well, this is in the presentation, but if you go to this website, on the ECBN website, you will find this, a place to sign up. So the first pillar here is the Pact for Skills. The second pillar is what's called the Blueprint, or what we call cyanotypes. And the idea is that these two initiatives will work in tandem. One of the most important distinctions between the two is that there's not very much money for the Pact for Skills, but there is money for the Blueprint. So if anything, this is a call for action, because we have the funds to be able to go out and to assess what needs to be done for our sector across the whole skills panorama. It is a stakeholder-based approach. So we have different types of businesses, small, medium, large. We have trade unions, chambers of commerce, those involved in higher education, but especially also those involved in vocational education and in training. What I notice actually is we don't have anybody representing financial investors or philanthropists. This is a missing stakeholder, I would say. So the idea is that the blueprint feeds back and forward to the Pact for Skills, which is the community. We have in our consortium, I don't know the total numbers, but for example, we have ELIA, which is the European League of Institutes of the Arts, and that's more than 260 art schools across Europe. We have the ECBN, you all know what that is. We have the European Creative Hub Network, again, more than 200 creative hubs, 25 countries. We have the European Forum of Vocational and Educational Training, who cover 34 countries. We have All Digital, which is a large association based in Brussels, who reach out through their digital skill centres to something like 1.5 million different people. And we have another 15 partners, all with different skills and different skill sets themselves to contribute to building this platform. I will skip that. I want to mention a little bit about the context in which we're operating. We are expected to anticipate future skills, and there is a need for a framework for this, somewhere where we can integrate specific sectoral skills with transversal skills. And however you describe transversal skills, there are lots of different ways of saying it, but they're typically skills that are not always found on the curriculum or in a training program or something like that. So one very common example, when you ask people what's a skill set that's missing or a hybrid competence, and you would talk about, for example, critical thinking. Now you might imagine that's something that should happen anyway, but it very often doesn't. We all know that's a problem. So these transversal skill sets have to be structured in some sort of way and blended with other specific skill sets into different modules and ultimately into a curriculum or into what's now called micro-learning or micro-credentials. So micro-credentials can be delivered in any type of setting, in a workplace, in a training setting, in an educational institution, in a vocational or a higher education. And this is quite an interesting model because it's very different from the way we've approached this in the past. So we're going to try and look at this from what's called here triple loop learning. And the idea here is taken from a book by Jeff Malgan. Some of you will know he was the head of Nesta in the UK for quite a while. And he talks about collective intelligence. And one remark he made is universities do research on everything except themselves. And this is very often the case. So with triple loop learning, very crudely put, first loop learning is what we would think about as everyday thinking, adapting our thought and action within an existing framework. This is common pretty much for everybody. In a sort of second loop, you introduce new categories because you find that what's there already is insufficient and that some of the models that we might be using need to be recharacterized. And then when you get to third loop learning, essentially you're relearning how to learn and you're rethinking how to think. Now, what we argue is that in our sector, we are terribly, terribly good at third loop learning and terribly, terribly bad at creating the narratives to explain that we're terribly, terribly good at it. So it's a little bit of a conundrum, but so in a sense, it's finding what's already there and restructuring this. And I think this is a little bit of the infrastructure that culture needs in these times. So this approach provides us with a framework. I'm skipping through this, but it's all in the slides. So essentially what I'm saying here is that we must practice what we preach. There's a great deal of knowledge and understanding which is implicit in the work that we do. And we somehow, when it comes to passing that on or transferring that kind of knowledge and information, it's not always happening. So in this project, I'm not just talking about how do we ensure the next generation of students are particularly good at X, Y, and Z. This also applies to us. Third loop learning applies to ourselves. We all do it, all the way through our careers, our lives, etc. And this is something where if you can move things to that level and you can adjust the way people think, so these basic characteristics, familiar to all of you, iterative, driven by error, surprise, experimentation, but with a logical flow from the small to the large, much more embraced in some sectors than others, and I would say much more embraced in our society and in the cultural and creative industries. So we will build in this notion of anticipation, this notion of what here you could say is scenario-based learning, because we have to stay ahead of the curve. This is common practice in businesses, small, medium, and large. You have to stay ahead of the curve, and at the moment you have to also anticipate the impact of multiple crises or eventualities, and you need skill sets, you need competencies to be able to do this. We all need it, and the next generation especially will need it. So how do we anticipate this? How do we give people skills in future thinking, in future literacies? How do we allow them to incorporate experience, expertise, and capacity for immersive engagement? Whether this addressing sustainability issues, environmental issues, climate issues, or looking at not just technological skill sets, but skill sets that relate to technological systems or understandings of social technological systems. So these are the kind of issues that we have to address. Now we have, during the course of this project, we've identified initially a few thematic areas that we want to look at, which we think are, if not common to every subsector of the CCI, but common to many. This is just an example, to give you an example. So we want to look at the digital transition, the green shift, but we don't, for the digital transition, it's not a question of looking at necessarily at specific digital skills, but looking at social technological systems. For the green shift, as Kirsten and others have said today, we need to understand how to talk about and understand the consequences of navigating through very complex adaptive systems. And to do that, you need a level and a degree of systems literacy, which does not exist currently across, let's say, those organizations who are perhaps designing curricula, etc. It's the same way we need to think more about co-creation of value. We need to think about not just entrepreneurial skills, but market design. How can we give people the skill sets to design new markets themselves? We know that about the participatory power of the arts. This is something we see a lot of, and you're all very much involved in it. But we also have to think about the anticipatory arts. And I think that's something that we can build on with this project and give people the skill sets they need to be able to do this themselves. This is a canvas that we use, basically saying something very similar to what I've just said, but it does show how there are perhaps the points where some movement is needed. So, for example, we need to talk a bit less perhaps about artificial intelligence. Of course, this is a very powerful technology, but very limited. It's very probabilistic. We need more than that. We need something around collective intelligence. What does that mean? How do we achieve it? How can we create ecosystems where it will emerge? Business canvas, learning about that is also very important, but what about a data ethics canvas? What about the understanding of data? What data literacy, data fluency? This is not something that you're going to be taught if you're educated within the arts at the moment. So these are areas that we would like to look at. We're not saying it should be this or it should be that. What we're saying is come to us and help us to define what we can define. So moving very quickly in, this is a summary which is yet to be put into a user-friendly piece of text. So we will work strategically, that's important, within a triple loop learning framework, combining existing skill sets, and we will co-create new skill sets within a flexible framework to respond to disruptive changes. In other words, the world in which we now live. During the first year, so the project just began actually last week, we have to define, scope out the strategies that we're going to deploy. We need to address already the urgent skills as far as post-COVID, the green shift, the digital transition, and we have to map the existing gaps. So in the first year, there's a lot of events, a lot of co-creation workshops, a lot of strategic workshops, and you're the people that need to come along and help us to define what we're going to do. We then get very busy because this is a bottom-up project. It's very grounded. So in the second year, we will start to develop the content to go with this. So we're not simply saying, here are policy recommendations, could you do something about it? We want to end up saying, here are the policy recommendations, here's a framework, here's a proven way of implementing it, could you do something about it? So we want to provide the context as well as the content. So we'll do the content and delivery methods in the second and third year, and we will have a number. At the end of the second year, we will ask you to help us to test what we're doing. Test it from your perspective. Test it from your sectoral perspective. Test it from your pedagogical perspective. It doesn't matter. Help us to test it. We will then have a number of pilots across Europe, quite a few. I'm not sure exactly what the total is, but something like 15 in the second and third year. And we will have an open call. And again, here, we would ask you to get involved to become a pilot region, to take what we give you, which will be an entire framework, and see if it is applicable in your country, but especially in your region, or even in your sector. What's missing? How can you use what we give you? How can we improve what we've done? So we'd ask you to get involved at that stage. And in the final year, we will have a long-term plan, combined with the work of, this is the blueprint, combined with the work of the Pact for Skills. So together, we want to find a way to make sure that this continues, because this is not a static process, it's a dynamic process. We have to constantly keep changing and creating new content. So, that's about it. I think that was brief enough. And Garen's gone to get the beer.